Welcome to True Scary Stories. This is the place where we share real horror stories, paranormal experiences, and mysterious phenomena from around the world. Don't forget to hit like, share, and comment to let us know your thoughts, and make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a scary story. On a cold, moonlit Halloween night in 2006, my family and I set off on a journey into the city. The air was thick with excitement, a blend of candy anticipation and the electric chill of the season. My mom had recently bought a car and needed to make a payment at the dealership. We thought it would be a great opportunity to let my little sister and her friend enjoy some city-style trick-or-treating. As my mom handled her business, my sister and her friend eagerly bounced from house to house, collecting treats in their pumpkin-shaped buckets. The streets were buzzing with laughter and shrieks, costumes of every imaginable kind parading under the dim glow of streetlights. But as the night deepened, a strange heaviness seemed to settle in. The laughter turned quieter, and the air colder. "We should wrap it up," my mom suggested. We still had a long drive back home, and the night was getting late. Reluctantly, my sister and her friend agreed, their bags full of candy weighing them down as we walked back to the car. Before hitting the road, we grabbed some fast food, a quick bite to fill our bellies for the journey ahead. The burger joint was buzzing with other families, some children still in costume, their makeup smudged from a night of fun. Finally, we piled back into the car, and my mom merged onto the freeway. The city lights gradually faded behind us, replaced by the dark, empty stretch of road ahead. It was peaceful at first, the hum of the car and the soft music from the radio, the only sounds breaking the silence of the night. My sister and her friend, tired from their adventures, began to nod off in the back seat. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something strange. A car was creeping up beside us, matching our speed. I glanced over, my curiosity piqued, and felt a sudden chill run down my spine. The driver was wearing a mask, an eerie, expressionless mask, and he was staring directly at us. His head was turned entirely sideways, eyes locked onto ours, unblinking. I nudged my mom, trying to keep my voice calm, but there was an undeniable tremor in my words. "Mom, look." She glanced over, her eyes widening in shock. "What the?" she muttered under her breath, her grip tightening on the steering wheel. The masked man continued to stare, his car perfectly in sync with ours. My sister and her friend, now fully awake, peered out the window, their sleepy eyes growing wide with fear. The atmosphere inside our car became tense, a palpable sense of dread creeping in. For what felt like an eternity, 10 long minutes to be exact, the masked driver kept pace with us, his head unnaturally turned, eyes never leaving our car. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, a cold sweat forming on my forehead. Every second stretched into a minute, every minute into an hour. The night, once filled with innocent fun, now felt suffocating, the darkness pressing in from all sides. And then, without warning, the driver turned his head forward, facing the road. He accelerated, speeding past us and disappearing into the night, swallowed by the darkness. We drove the rest of the way home in silence, the image of that mask burned into our minds. None of us spoke about it, as if saying it out loud would somehow give it more power, make it more real. A year passed. The memory of that night had faded, though not completely forgotten. Halloween came around again in 2007. This time it was just me and my little brother. We decided to keep the tradition alive, trick-or-treating in a nearby neighborhood. After a few hours of collecting candy and sharing scares, we grabbed a quick bite to eat and set out on the freeway to head back home. The road was busy, filled with cars making their way back from Halloween festivities. I was relaxed, my mind wandering as my brother sifted through his candy in the seat beside me. Suddenly, out of the mass of vehicles, one car caught my attention. It was pulling up beside us, keeping pace. A cold sense of déjà vu washed over me as I turned to look. There he was again. A different car, but the same eerie mask, the same twisted stare. His head was turned completely toward us, just like before, his eyes locked onto ours. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My brother, noticing my unease, followed my gaze and gasped. "Is that—" he started, his voice trembling. I nodded, too afraid to speak, my eyes darting between the road and the masked figure beside us. We were going 60 miles per hour, but it didn't matter. He kept up, his gaze fixed on us like a predator eyeing its prey. 10 minutes crawled by, each second filled with the relentless stare of the masked man. The fear was suffocating, a tangible thing that seemed to fill the car, making it hard to breathe. And then, just as suddenly as he appeared, he turned his head to face the road and sped up, weaving through the traffic, disappearing once again into the sea of cars. This time, I couldn't keep quiet. I pulled over to the side of the road, my heart racing, my mind struggling to make sense of what just happened. My brother was shaking, clutching his bag of candy as if it could protect him from the darkness that seemed to be closing in around us. 2 Halloweens, 2 encounters with the same masked stranger. Was it a coincidence? A prank? Or something far more sinister? I didn't know, but one thing was clear. Halloween had become more than just a night of costumes and candy for us. It had become a night of terror, a night where the shadows held secrets and the masks hid something far darker than mere faces. And every year since then, as Halloween approaches, I can't help but wonder, will he return? And if he does, who will be his next victim? On a chilly Halloween night in 2008, the moon hung low and heavy in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the small, quiet town. Most of the town's residents were celebrating with costumes, laughter, and the joyous sounds of children trick-or-treating. But in one dark, desolate house on the edge of town, horror was unfolding. The old mansion had been abandoned for years, its windows shattered and walls covered in a creeping ivy that seemed to choke the life out of the building. That night, the darkness inside the mansion was more profound, an impenetrable void that seemed to swallow any light that dared to enter. The wind howled through the broken windows, carrying with it the faintest echo of cries, soft, barely audible, but undeniably chilling. At 10:34 p.m., a frantic call pierced through the night air, reaching the local police station. The voice on the other end was shaky, almost incoherent with fear. There's been a murder," the caller whispered, their breath coming in short, terrified gasps. "So many bodies, blood everywhere. Please, send help." 2 of the town's most seasoned homicide detectives, Detective Miller and Detective Harper, were dispatched to the scene. As their car pulled up to the mansion, they were struck by a heavy, oppressive silence. The house loomed over them like a dark specter, its shadow long and foreboding under the pale moonlight. The detectives cautiously approached the front door, which was ajar, creaking softly in the wind. Inside, the air was thick with the metallic scent of blood, mingling with the musty odor of decay and neglect. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing a gruesome tableau. Bodies strewn across the floor, each one contorted in a final, desperate pose. Miller and Harper moved carefully, trying not to disturb the bodies as they began their investigation. The floor was slick with blood, reflecting the dim beams of their flashlights. The detectives took pictures of each body, documenting the horrific scene in meticulous detail. As Miller snapped a photo of a young woman whose lifeless eyes stared blankly at the ceiling, Harper's flashlight caught something on the far wall. He squinted, trying to make sense of the dark marks smeared across the faded wallpaper. "Miller," he called out, his voice low and tense. "There's something written over here." Miller walked over, his footsteps echoing in the unnaturally quiet room. As he approached the wall, he could see what Harper had spotted, numbers hastily scrawled in blood. 7734, he read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. The numbers sent a shiver down his spine, though he couldn't explain why. There was something deeply unsettling about them, something that seemed almost Wrong. Harper raised his camera and took a picture of the numbers. As he did, his hand trembled slightly, and he accidentally tilted the camera upside down. The flash illuminated the numbers again, casting strange, shifting shadows on the wall. Harper glanced down at the digital display, preparing to delete the accidental photo. But then, something caught his eye. He froze, staring at the screen. "Miller," he said, his voice barely a breath. "Look at this." Miller leaned in, his eyes narrowing at the screen. Upside down, the numbers 7734 transformed, morphing into a single chilling word, H-E-L-L. A cold wave of dread washed over them both. The room seemed to grow colder, the air heavier. Miller's heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, more to himself than to Harper. Suddenly, the house seemed to groan around them, as if it were a living entity waking from a long slumber. The walls creaked, and the floorboards beneath their feet shifted with a low, guttural moan. A chill wind swept through the room, snuffing out their flashlights. In the darkness, Miller and Harper felt a presence, a malevolent force that seemed to press in from all sides. The faint sound of whispers filled the air, a chorus of anguished voices, rising and falling like a ghostly chant. They couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Despair, pain, and something else. Something darker. Miller fumbled for his flashlight, his fingers numb with fear. He finally managed to switch it back on, the beam slicing through the darkness. He swept the light across the room, but the bodies were gone. The floor, once slick with blood, was now clean. The only trace of the massacre a faint stain where the numbers had been written. "Harper," Miller whispered, his voice trembling. "We need to get out of here." But Harper didn't respond. Miller turned the flashlight toward his partner, only to find him standing in the middle of the room, his eyes wide and unseeing, his face pale as death. In his hand, the camera dangled, forgotten. "Harper!" Miller shouted, rushing over to him. He shook his partner's shoulder, but Harper didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the wall, on the spot where the numbers had been. Miller followed his gaze, and his breath caught in his throat. The numbers were back, but they had changed. They no longer read 7734. Instead, they spelled out a new word, one that sent a bolt of pure terror through Miller's heart. "Join us." At that moment, the room exploded with sound, a deafening roar like 1,000 voices screaming in unison. The walls shook, and the floor buckled beneath them. Miller grabbed Harper and pulled him toward the door, his only thought to escape the nightmare they had stumbled into. They burst out of the mansion, gasping for air, the cold night wind hitting them like a slap. Behind them, the house was silent once more, the dark windows staring back at them like empty eyes. As they stood there, catching their breath, Miller glanced back at the mansion. For a moment he thought he saw a figure standing in the window, watching them, but when he blinked, it was gone. The detectives never spoke of what they saw that night. The mansion was boarded up, left to rot and decay, but the memory of those blood-written numbers haunted them both, a constant reminder of the horrors that lurk just beyond the veil of the ordinary world. And every Halloween, when the wind howls through the trees and the moon casts its ghostly light, the townsfolk swear they can hear whispers coming from the old mansion, whispers that speak of lost souls and the unspeakable things that wait in the shadows, just out of sight. On a chilly Halloween night in 2009, a thick fog rolled through a small, quiet town, blanketing the streets in an eerie mist. The town's old cemetery, perched at the edge of a dark forest, was known for its ghostly tales and sinister reputation. A narrow path wound alongside the cemetery, where twisted trees loomed over it like skeletal fingers, their branches swaying gently in the cold breeze. It was a place most townsfolk avoided, especially after dark. But for two mischievous boys, the path was the perfect setting for a Halloween prank. Eager for a thrill, the boys hatched a devious plan. They found a pair of tall, gnarled trees that stood opposite each other, their branches reaching out like hands ready to grasp anything in their way. From these trees, the boys stretched a thin, nearly invisible fishing line across the path, just about head height. The idea was simple. Wait for someone to come down the path and at just the right moment, pull the line tight to knock off the unsuspecting victim's hat. It was a prank that would scare anyone half to death, and the boys could barely contain their excitement. The night was growing darker, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. Finally, they spotted their first victim. A lone man walking slowly along the path, his hat pulled low to shield his face from the cold. As he neared the fishing line, the boys tensed with anticipation. They watched, their eyes wide with glee, and as the man stepped closer, they yanked the line with all their might. The fishing line whipped through the air, catching the brim of the man's hat and sending it flying. The man gasped, stumbled back, and then, to the boys' delight, turned and sprinted away into the darkness, leaving his hat behind. The boys stifled their laughter, thrilled that their prank had worked perfectly. Encouraged by their success, they decided to do it again. They reset the fishing line and crouched back down in the shadows, waiting for their next victim. Minutes passed, and the wind grew colder, the air around them heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. Then, through the mist, they saw it, a tall, dark figure moving slowly along the path. The figure was unlike any they had seen before. It was shrouded in a long, flowing black cloak that seemed to absorb the light around it, casting an unnatural darkness in its wake. The boys squinted, trying to make out any details, but the figure's face was hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. A chill ran down their spines, but they were too caught up in their prank to back down now. This was going to be their best scare yet. As the shadowy figure approached the fishing line, the boys tightened their grip. They could feel their hearts pounding in their chests, each beat louder than the last. The figure glided closer, its footsteps silent against the gravel path. The boys took a deep breath, and just as the figure was about to pass the line, they pulled it with all the force they could muster. But this time something was different. Instead of the soft thud of a hat being knocked off, there was a sickening, wet, ripping sound. The boys froze, their eyes wide with horror as they realized what they had done. The figure's head seemed to detach from its body, spinning through the air before landing with a heavy thud on the ground. The head rolled to a stop just inches from the boys' feet, its lifeless eyes staring up at them, empty and cold. For a moment, there was a deafening silence. The boys stared at the head in shock, their hands trembling, the fishing line still clutched tightly between their fingers. Then, slowly, the figure's body collapsed to the ground, the cloak billowing out around it like a pool of darkness. Panic surged through the boys. They scrambled down from their trees, their breath coming in ragged gasps. One of them nudged the severed head with his foot, and to their horror, it began to move. The mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, and a low, guttural laugh echoed through the trees, sending shivers down their spines. The boys stumbled back, too terrified to scream, as the headless body began to twitch and stir. Suddenly, the air grew colder, and the fog thickened, swirling around them like a living thing. The laughter grew louder, a chorus of voices whispering from all directions. The boys could feel something pressing in on them, an unseen force closing in, suffocating them with its presence. They turned and ran, their feet pounding against the gravel, but no matter how fast they ran, the laughter followed them, echoing in their ears louder and louder. They didn't stop until they were far from the cemetery, their lungs burning and their legs trembling with exhaustion. They collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath, too terrified to speak. The fishing line was still in their hands, the evidence of their prank gone horribly wrong. They looked at each other, their faces pale and drawn, and for the first time that night, they realized that some things were better left undisturbed. The next day, the townspeople found the boys huddled together on the steps of the old church, their eyes wide and haunted. They never spoke of what they saw that night, but those who passed by the cemetery claimed they could hear whispers on the wind, and sometimes, if the night was just right, They'd see a tall, dark figure gliding silently along the path, its head held in its hands, searching for something or someone. The boys left town soon after, and no one ever saw them again. But every Halloween, as the fog rolls in and the shadows lengthen, the townsfolk remember the story of the two boys and the dark figure they disturbed. And they know, deep in their hearts, that some pranks are not worth the price.